Okay, I've been speaking on whether Christians should be supporting Israel. This is the final one I'm going to do on that before we go back to Revelation. Ken is joining on Zoom. For those of you who don't know, he was in hospital to have some additional tumors removed. And he is back, but he's still feeling a bit weak. So just a brief recap. We saw in Genesis that God established a covenant with Abraham, the forefather of the Jewish nation. He promised him three things: source of blessing to the nations, land, and descendants, and that a great nation would come from him. And I pointed out that Israel, or the Jews, have been a blessing to the world. It tells us in the New Testament primarily because of the fact that the seed of Abraham was Jesus. And it says in Romans 9 that from them are the patriarchs and the human ancestry of the Messiah. And from them we received the scriptures. But besides being a blessing in the spiritual realm, I pointed out the first time how Israel has blessed the world in many other ways. And I just want to quote here from a speech from October 2015 in New York at the United Nations when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke, the Prime Minister of Israel. He said, Israel is a world leader in science and technology, in cyber, software, water, agriculture, medicine, biotechnology, and so many other fields that have been revolutionized by Israeli ingenuity and Israeli innovation. He added, Israeli know-how is everywhere. It's in your computers, microprocessors and flash drives. It's in your smartphones. That's why it's quite funny. These guys that say they want to boycott Israeli products, or you're going to stop using your phone and your computer and stop taking some of your medicine. When you send instant messages and navigate your cars. It's on your farms when you drip irrigate your crops and keep your grains and produce fresh. It's in your university when you study Nobel Prize winning discoveries. Remember, I showed you that Israel, or the Jews, have got more Nobel Prize winners, far more than any other nation. When you study Nobel Prize winning discoveries in chemistry and economics, it's in your medicine cabinets when you use drugs to treat Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis. It's even on your plate when you eat the delicious cherry tomato. That too was perfected in Israel, in case you didn't know. We are so proud in Israel of the long strides our country has made in a short time. We're so proud that our small country is making such a huge contribution to the entire world. Yet the dreams of our people, enshrined for eternity by the great prophets of the Bible, those dreams won't be fully realized only when there is peace. And so despite what they've done and the contributions they've made to the world, their desire is peace. And we know from prophecy that someone is going to come along and promise peace and even negotiate a peace treaty, but it will be the false Messiah, the Antichrist. God promised them land, and that land includes what today is Israel. So they have a God-given right to their land, a right to be a nation, and a right, as does any other sovereign nation, to defend themselves when they are attacked by terrorists. I pointed out how the Jubilee year in Scripture is very significant, that it happened every 50th year in the Old Testament. And one of the things that happened in the year of Jubilee is that property was restored to its original owners. And we saw how from 1517 to 1917, what is today Israel, along with a lot of the Middle East, was ruled by the Ottoman Turks. But then after this period of 8 Jubilees in 1917, the British, after or during World War I rather, they liberated the city of Jerusalem and the country of what today is Israel, and they declared, they issued the Balfour Declaration as well at that time, which was a promise of land to the Jews in that area. And exactly 50 years later, another Jubilee, the Jordanian occupied city of Jerusalem, the old city, was recaptured by Israel. And exactly 50 years after that, in 2017, the US officially recognized Jerusalem as the capital city, despite opposition from the other UN nations. And then he promised Abram that they'd be a great nation. He promised to bless those nations who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. And that alone is good enough reason to support them. And so any nation, as I pointed out, in the world, including our own, who seeks to harm Israel will come under God's curse and his judgment, sooner or later. I told you how I believe that God has blessed the USA because of its support for Israel. It's the one country that has consistently supported Israel, and God said, I will bless those who bless you. And it just happens to be the country that has 1/3 of the total wealth in the world in one country. Is it coincidence that they happen to be the country that bless Israel? Truman, the US president, was the first to recognize the nation of Israel when it was declared. In contrast, the Arab nations around it all declared war on it the same day. And Israel is the largest recipient of US foreign aid. Just this week, the 14th of November, there was close to 300,000 who marched in Israel in support for Israel and decrying anti-Semitism. Didn't get much coverage in the news. You get the smaller little marches of those who are pro-Palestine, normally because they burning buildings and assaulting the police. But this was a peaceful demonstration. 300,000 in Washington, and it was bipartisan as well, supported by both Republicans and Democrats. It was actually the largest pro-Israel rally in the history of the United States. There's actually going to be a march in South Africa this afternoon. So if you need details on that or want to attend, I know there are buses available. Speak to Prudence. It's going to be in Pretoria. I know they had to keep it fairly low profile because, again, they're worried about violence from the peaceful opposition who support Palestine. And so any nation that curses Israel, we see will be cursed by God. And the first nation that cursed them was the Egyptians. In the Bible, they enslaved them and they threw their baby sons into the Nile River. And you know the story. God sends Moses to Pharaoh to warn him, let my people go. And he refuses. And we have these terrible plagues that are unleashed on Egypt. And ultimately, the 10th one, the worst, where the firstborn of every household, firstborn son dies. Interesting, they threw the Jewish sons into the river Nile, and now their own children die. I will curse those who curse you. And eventually Pharaoh lets them go, but then he relents, and he pursues them, and he and his army are destroyed in the Red Sea. The Amorites, while they're heading to the promised land, I'm not going to give you every single instance, but here's some of the more well-known ones. Israel wants to go through their land, and they send messages to the king. They even say they won't drink any water, they won't disturb any fields. And despite that, Sihon refuses. He assembles an army against them, and not only is he defeated by Israel, they take all his cities. The book of Judges, they're oppressed by the Midianites, and they're impoverished. They steal their food. They call out to God for help, and he raises up Gideon. And again, you know the story. He uses a small army, only 300 men, to show that it was God doing the work. And it says that the army of the Midianites and the Amalekites numbered as the sand by the seashore, and yet God delivers them from Midian. In Babylon, well-known one from the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar and his armies destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They take many Jews into exile. Many of the books in the Old Testament, like Daniel, for instance, are written by Jews who are in exile in Babylon. And years later, Belshazzar, again recorded in the book of Daniel, the last king of that empire, He sees God's judgment written, proclaimed on the wall, while he's busy blasphemously desecrating the utensils that were used in the Jewish temple and drinking from them at their drunken party. And that very night, he's killed and the empire is lost to the Persians and the Medes. The Seleucids, this was one of the break-offs of the Greek Hellenic Empire that was started by Alexander the Great. This man in particular, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, hated the Jews. He outlawed their religious practices. They weren't allowed to be circumcised. He even desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig in the temple and setting up an altar to Zeus, a pagan god. Sure why that's popping up, but let's get rid of it. And this gave rise to the revolt of the Maccabees, Judah Maccabee and his brothers. And even though they were totally outnumbered by these much greater armies, they consistently would humiliate them, defeat them, and ultimately that temple that had been desecrated, they would rededicate it to God. And as for Antiochus Epiphanes, well, he died of an illness while he was returning from Parthia. He was in Persia, about 50 to 51 years of age, and that was his untimely end. Many people know the Nazi Holocaust. Might be too far back for you who aren't students of history to remember that in the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were terrible pogroms in Russia. It was home to the world's largest Jewish population at that time. They put the Jews in ghettos and they attacked them in pogroms. They blamed the Jews for all their woes, their economic and political problems. In 1871, with the tacit approval of the authorities, they attacked the Jews in the city of Odessa, and they were rebuked by the US State Department under President Grant, the famous general from the Civil War. And this caused a massive immigration of Jews, many of them to America, which is why America has got such a large population of Jews. It used to be Russia. One of the most infamous pogroms was in Kishinev in 1903. It resulted in the deaths of dozens of Jews. And it was because of that there started to be calls for a Jewish state to prevent attacks like that. I won't give you all the details. The details are quite gruesome. You can read them in the notes. According to the Washington Post, homicidal gangs stalked the streets, chasing down Jews and beating them lifeless with crowbars. One victim, this Mordecai Chopin, was dragged out of a shed where he was hiding by a mob and bludgeoned to death with poles. And some of the bodies were disemboweled, kind of similar to the kind of things we've seen Hamas do as well, although the world turns a blind eye. There were also pogroms during the Russian Revolution as well. Various factions attacking Jewish communities. Interesting, those terrible pogroms happened under the reign of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 3 centuries. And yet they lost their throne in 1917 to the communists. And you should know that they suffered terribly in the 20th century under the communists, a very oppressive regime, one of the cruelest regimes in history. I will curse those who curse you. Dave Hunt, well-known Christian author, relays this. I thought I'd just read it to you. It's not very well known. He said, in contrast to the favored treatment of Arab refugees, you see a lot about that in the news, the full treatment of the inhuman treatment of Jewish refugees during World War II, let alone throughout the centuries, would fill a library. One seldom mentioned crime was the deliberate drowning of hundreds in the Black Sea. On the 12th of December 1941, the Struma left Romania bound for Palestine, which was under British rule then. The 769 Jewish refugees aboard, including 103 children and infants, were fleeing the Nazi Holocaust and paid exorbitant fees, only to find themselves escaping Hitler on a dilapidated Greek cattle barge with only one bathroom, an engine that kept breaking down, and scarcely room for 100 people. The fare was supposed to have included entry visas to be picked up in Istanbul, that's in Turkey. When the disabled vessel was finally towed into Istanbul with a dead engine, the Struma was anchored in a quarantine section of the port, and no one, including the crew, was allowed ashore. There, the passengers endured a living hell for 71 days. The only water and food was supplied by Jewish benefactors. It was then that the refugees learned that they were victims of a hoax, more cruel than they had imagined. The promised immigration certificates in Istanbul did not exist. The British, who controlled Palestine under a mandate to make it the Jewish national home, but kept Jews out, forbade the Turkish government to allow the Struma through the Bosphorus Strait to the Mediterranean, a needless prohibition because all efforts to repair the engine failed. To return to Romania, because it was under Nazi occupation, even if possible, would have meant death. Finally, on February the 23rd, 1942, under British pressure, Turkish police forcefully came aboard, cut the anchor chains, and towed the helpless vessel with its occupants far into the Black Sea. The Struma was blown apart and sunk early the next morning by a Russian sub, for which the sub's commander, Lieutenant Denesko, was given a medal. There was only one survivor, except for one pregnant woman who had been taken ashore to have a baby. And this was this man over here. And though near dead and unable to walk, he was confined to a Turkish jail. And Dave Hunt mentions that at that stage he was in Oregon in the US and he was interviewed. So this is not fake news. Entire shipload of people sunk and the Russian sub-commander given a medal simply because they were fleeing the Nazis to go to a Jewish homeland. There's plenty that could be said on this, and most of the things that could be shown are too graphic to display. Nazi Germany under Hitler murdered 6 million Jews less than 100 years ago. They are just some of the Jews who managed to escape the concentration camp. And the Nazis in Germany, they referred to their rule, the Third Reich, as the 1,000-year Reich. And it lasted 12 years. Because the Allies defeated Germany, Hitler committed suicide, his corpse was burnt, Germany was divided, and the capital city. Those of you older like me will remember when Berlin was a divided city, and East Germany was dominated by their enemies, the Russians, for decades. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. The modern Arab states, in the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel had 75,000 troops. The Arab armies who were attacking her had more than 500,000. Israel was outgunned and had far fewer resources. But they seized the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt as well as the Gaza Strip. They took the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and they took the Golan Heights from Syria, fighting on 3 fronts. And they did that all in 6 days. And then, of course, as we have today, immediately when Israel starts winning, the UN insists on a ceasefire. But despite the fact that they did that, Israel had already quadrupled its territory in 6 days. Estimates show that around 20,000 Arabs had died in 132 hours of fighting. Fewer than 900 Israelis died. Egyptian President Nasser, pictured over there, he was the big instigator, the one with the big mouth, who was always mouthing threats against Israel. He had to resign in disgrace because he kept on going on about how they were going to annihilate Israel off the map. And it turned out that his entire air force was obliterated on the ground. I think 2 of their planes got off. In the Bible, you read the book of Esther. Haman, the Persian, well, he lived in Persia. We're going to see his ancestry, something about that. He despised the Jews. And he tried to get King Ahasuerus, otherwise known most likely as Xerxes, to make an edict to kill the Jews. And he was successful. They actually had an edict that on a certain day, it was a free-for-all where people could go and target the Jews. And he also sought the death of Mordecai, the Jew, Esther's relative, by hanging. So he was a racist. He wanted to slaughter entire people groups solely on the basis of their race, just because they were Jewish. And tragically, it will happen again. We are told in Zechariah 13:8 that 2/3 of all the Jews will be killed by Antichrist. Hitler managed to kill 2/3 of all the Jews in Europe. 2/3 of all the Jews. And so when Jesus spoke on the Mount of Olives, in his sobering prophecy, he said that when that generation happened, that the Jews must flee to the mountains. Because he says, then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Something that's worse even than the Holocaust, than the pogroms, and what Haman did. And so Haman, like Hitler, was a type of the Antichrist, and like Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember, Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple, so will the Antichrist. And the Antichrist will have the same goal, killing Jews. And there we can just see the similarities of between Haman and the Antichrist. Haman issues a decree that everyone should bow to him. We see that in Revelation, all inhabitants of the earth are commanded to worship the Antichrist. Haman intends to kill dissenters who will not bow to him. And in Revelation, we're told that those who don't worship the Antichrist are beheaded. Haman brags about his wealth and influence. And Daniel 7 verse 8 says of the Antichrist that he had a mouth that spoke boastfully. 4 times Haman is called the enemy of the Jews. And in Revelation 12 verse 7, we see how the dragon, who's Satan, using the Antichrist, is enraged with Israel and makes war against her offspring, the Jews, and how they have to flee into the desert. Haman tries to kill all the Jews in the Medo-Persian Empire. And the Antichrist, as I've said, will kill 2/3 of all Jews in his empire. But in the book of Esther, we see, as God has done time and again, like he did with Gideon, when they were totally outnumbered, as what happened in the 6-day war in modern times, when they were totally outnumbered. Here, we see in Esther 9 verse 1 that this decree that has been passed to slaughter the Jews, well, you know how Esther intervenes, and the king, although he can't revoke the decree, he passes another one which allows them to defend themselves, self-defense. And it says, on this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. And so these people who are hoping to kill the Jews or not get any opposition got a bit of surprise, just as I think Hamas has probably got. Far from being eradicated, the Jews defended themselves, got the upper hand, and Mordecai actually becomes the second in command, like Joseph before him, like Daniel also gets a position of prominence. And 75,000 of the Persians are killed as they attempt to destroy the Jews. So Haman and all the anti-Semitic people there were eagerly waiting to resolve the Jewish question like Hitler. And on that day, it was legal to kill Jews and take their property. What's interesting is that happened in Persia. 2,500 years later, Persia is now called Iran. And you know, is the nation who hates Israel the most? Iran. They're the nation who bankrolls Hamas, normally using the foreign aid, people who give money that's supposedly going to refugees and actually goes for rockets and building tunnels and arms. They also bankroll Hezbollah, who are constantly shooting rockets at Israel from Lebanon. Hossein Salami, thought it was an interesting name. Deputy commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps said Hezbollah, remember they're the guys who are in Lebanon, have 100,000 missiles that are ready to hit Israel to liberate the occupied Palestinian territories if the Zionist regime repeats its past mistakes. That was in 2017. The former Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he always used to say, you can remember his name as I'm in a jihad. And okay, he was very anti-Israel. And he, in one of his speeches, vowed to eliminate the Zionist regime. He took part in a protest called The World Without Zionism. He derided Israel on numerous occasions, and he urged regional powers to cut diplomatic and economic ties with Israel, sort of like what our nation is doing. Sadly, these are the guys that we go into alliance with. In the BRICS alliance, we are allied with Russia and with China, who both you've seen are anti-Israel. But next year, you know, has been added to the BRICS alliance, Iran. And those are the guys we choose to trade with. Iran has continued to fund Hamas, allowing to rebuild its tunnel network and rocket armory, which it's used repeatedly against the Israelis. And so keep this in mind, because remember that alliance at the end of time, Gog Magog, and the number one ally of Magog, who we believe is Russia, is Persia, which is Iran. And so we see Bible prophecy being fulfilled through our eyes. Keep it in mind when you see South African businesses boycotting Israeli products, when you hear casual anti-Semitism from friends or larger anti-Semitism from our government or from the EFF, who are now calling to have the Israeli ambassador ousted from South Africa. And so those who oppose Israel will find that they face an outcome they did not expect. Maybe if they read their Bibles. The promise that God made to Abram is eternal. God curses those who curse his people. There's never been a world power that persecuted the Jews that remained great. And the same will be true in the end days with the Gog-Magog war and all her allies when they gather against Israel. And we know in the book of Ezekiel it prophesies their destruction. The entire world gathered against one nation. And so again, Netanyahu, speaking at the UN, he did this on the occasion when the world leaders were entering into a nuclear deal with Israel. It's quite clear with Iran. Iran wants to desperately get nuclear weapons, and it will use those to destroy Israel. And Netanyahu refused to celebrate the deal. He complained that the deal didn't make peace more likely, but made war more likely. He warned that the deal would make Iran more dangerous. In fact, a week before he spoke, the commander of Iran's army publicly proclaimed, "We will annihilate Israel for sure." And yet the UN decided that there should be some way of ultimately allowing Iran to get nuclear weapons. That's like allowing Hitler to get nuclear weapons. This was part of Netanyahu's response. I know that preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons remains the official policy of the international community, but no one should question Israel's determination to defend itself against those who seek our destruction. For in every generation where there were those who rose up to destroy our people. In antiquity, we faced destruction from the ancient empires of Babylon and Rome. In the Middle Ages, we faced inquisition and expulsion. And in modern times, we faced pogroms and the Holocaust. Yet the Jewish people persevered. And now another regime has arisen, swearing to destroy Israel. That regime would be wise to consider this. I stand here today representing Israel, a country 67 years young, but the nation state of a people nearly 4,000 years old. Yet the empires of Babylon and Rome are not represented in this hall of nations. Neither is the 1,000-year Reich. Those seemingly invincible empires are long gone, but Israel lives. And so clearly we're dealing with far more than racial hatred. Because Satan knows that if he can destroy Israel, he can disprove God and the promises of God, because God has promised to bless them, and Satan wants to have them all destroyed to try to disprove the promises of God. In the same way that Satan hates Christians, well, he hates the Jews as well. But as in the time of Esther, God not only can, he will vindicate and he will protect his covenant people, both his old covenant people and his new covenant people. And as you read accounts like Gideon and Esther and the 6-Day War and all these accounts where forces that are much larger than Israel are overpowered. Again, I want to remind you of the events of 1967. Israel, a fledgling nation, and the combined might of the Arab nations who wanted to destroy her, wipe her off the map. And as I told you, the world was astounded when in 6 days, Israel, fighting on 3 fronts against greater numerical forces, ended up quadrupling their territory, facing what seemed like certain doom. This is what Life magazine reported. Astounding is the only word for it. In 60 hours, the war that exploded upon the Middle East became a fact of history. Tiny Israel stood in the role of victor over the surrounding Arab nations that vowed to exterminate her. Middle Eastern alliances, balances of power, even political boundaries were of a new shape, as though mutated by a biblical cataclysm. Seldom in military history has victory been so efficient or so visible, decisive in so short a span of time. So swiftly did Israel mount her assault that her adversaries were deprived of the means of winning almost before the world awakened to the fact that a war was in progress. So this last section, I want to talk about what I call the Agag connection. Agag was another sworn enemy of Israel. He was the king of the Amalekites. When Israel was weak and they were leaving Egypt, remember, they were leaving as liberated slaves, not a well-equipped army. And we are told that the Amalekites actually attacked them from the rear and tried to destroy them. So they targeted the weak, those who were lagging behind, typically like what we have seen Hamas do, where they've targeted babies and women, these brave soldiers of liberation. And that's what the Amalekites did. And so Moses had instructed the Israelites God's decree that the Amalekites should be destroyed, we are told in Deuteronomy 25. And if you read 1 Samuel, find that Saul, through the prophet Samuel, was given that instruction that he was to exercise that directive from Moses and destroy the Amalekites. Now, you may say, well, why would God want to do that? Well, God knows the future. And he knew what the results would be if they did not completely eradicate the Amalekites, which they didn't, because Saul was disobedient. If you read the story, you find firstly that Saul spared the king. But let me just read this to you. It's from God Questions. They say, if Israel did not carry out God's orders, the Amalekites would come back to trouble the Israelites in the future. Saul claimed to have killed everyone but the king, Agag. Obviously, Saul was lying or mistaken. Just a couple of decades later, there were enough Amalekites to take David and his men's families captive in 1 Samuel 30. After David and his men attacked the Amalekites and rescued their families, 400 Amalekites escaped. If Saul had fulfilled what God had commanded him, this never would have happened. But several hundred years later, there was a descendant of Agag, and you know who he was? Haman, the man who tried to have all the Jews killed in Persia. So why did God instruct Moses and Saul to destroy the Amalekites? Because God knows the future and he knew what would be the outcome. When Saul was disobedient with regards to destroying all the Amalekites along with their king, you find that Samuel came and he did execute the enemy king. So Agag thought he had escaped. He thought he'd be spared until he heard the pronouncement by Samuel. And you know what Samuel said to him? Listen to this, because I'll refer to it later. Well, I don't know what happened there. The thing has decided to zoom in. There we go. Samuel said to him, as your sword, bereaved woman, so will your mother be bereaved among women. It's like these guys who like want a free punch in the Middle East. They attack Israel, kill their women, rape others, behead their babies, and take pictures of themselves while they're doing that. And then when Israel responds, they want a ceasefire. Well, Agag wanted a ceasefire as well. But Samuel says, as your sword, bereaved woman, so will your mother be bereaved among women. You can say that the Nazis were the spiritual descendants of the Amalekites, because they also preyed upon the Jews in a desperate and a weak state. It's Adolf Eichmann there. He played a key role in the deportation of Jews to the death camps. Towards the end of the war, he said that he would leap laughing into the grave because the feeling that he had 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a source of extraordinary satisfaction. This is a man who would also ask for mercy. Like Agag, he thought he'd escaped justice. He fled to Argentina after the war. Very well-known account. He was later captured by the Mossad agents. They not only captured him, they whisked him out of the country without the knowledge of the government, and they took him back to Israel and they convicted him as a war criminal. There he is there in the dock. And when he was sentenced to death, his wife sent a plea for clemency by telegram to Israeli President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. And you know what he put in his reply? He quoted Samuel's words. He said, as your sword, bereaved woman, so will your mother be bereaved among women. In the book of Esther, it ends after this great victory that the Jews celebrate, and that celebration becomes something that they would do annually, and it was called Purim. And they still celebrate Purim 2,500 years later, where they remember how God intervened and delivered them from the hands of an enemy who wanted to eradicate the Jewish race. Purim. Esther 9, verse 7 to 10, I'm not going to read all these names. It says they also killed, and it gives a whole list of names. And it turns out these are the 10 sons of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Now you may wonder, well, why did they list all these names? There are many people in the Bible who aren't even named. And yeah, these guys are named explicitly. Why? Now remember, Haman had 10 sons. And as I pointed out, he's a type of the coming Antichrist who will turn on the Jews and seek to destroy him. It's interesting that we see in prophecy that the Antichrist has 10 kings who allied with him. Remember the 10 horns? Well, Haman had 10 sons who were destroyed by hanging. And so as Haman and his sons were defeated and his 10 sons were hanged, so the Antichrist, of whom Haman is a type, and the 10 kingdoms that are allied with the Antichrist against God's people are defeated at the return of Jesus. But again, why bother to list the names of Haman's sons? Pretty sure even the good Bible scholars here wouldn't be able to give me even one of those names. If you can, come speak to me afterwards. We'll employ you as a lecturer at the college. Esther 9, verse 12 to 14. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. Note what he says. The Jews have destroyed the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. Now, what is your petition? It shall be even be granted you. And what is your further request? It shall also be done. And Esther makes a very strange request. Well, the first part, not so strange. She asks if the Jews could continue to defend themselves again the following day. But she says, let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. And so the king commanded that it should be done so. And an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. So the king granted a request. But it's an unusual request. Why? Remember what the king said to her? He said Haman's sons had been destroyed. They were already dead. Why hang a person who's already dead? Now, it's possible because that was the fate that Haman had wanted to inflict on Mordecai. If you read Esther, you'll find that he had built a gallows. Well, we're not too sure whether it's a gallows or a stake, but irrespective, it's traditionally known as the gallows, this very large gallows where he wanted to publicly hang Mordecai. And she requests that Haman's sons be hung. So perhaps that was why she asked for that, even though they were already dead. But there's another interesting prophetic type indicated here. Remember the Amalekites and Haman tried to eradicate the Jews off the face of the earth, so did the Nazis. And in the Holocaust, 6 million European Jews were exterminated in death camps. They initially shot them, and when that was not quick enough, they would gas them, make them strip naked and go into the showers where they would be gassed. And the bodies burned. The city of Nuremberg in Germany was the place where the infamous anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws had been passed. In those laws, they prohibited Germans from marrying Jews, and it was effectively outlawed, the Nuremberg racial laws. It was also the home of a Nazi propagandist called Julius Streicher, who published a weekly anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper. As early as 1933 and during the war, he regularly authorized articles in the paper calling for the extermination of the Jewish race. This was Julius Streicher in Nuremberg. Hitler forbade the observation of Purim. Remember Purim, where they celebrated their victory over the Persians? In a speech made on the 10th of November 1938, the day after Kristallnacht, that's when they went and looted all the Jewish businesses and killed Jews. and broke the glass of the shops. Julius Streicher surmised that just as the Jews butchered 75,000 Persians in one night, the same fate would have befallen the German people had the Jews succeeded in inciting a war against Germany. And he said the Jews would have instituted a new Purim festival in Germany. They were not ignorant of what the scripture said. On Purim, this day of celebration over their victors in 1942, 10 Jews were hanged. Remember? The 10 sons of Haman were hanged. Well, on Purim in 1942, they chose to hang 10 Jews in Zudunska Wola to avenge the hanging of Haman's 10 sons. This was the Nazis. So they are making this connection between themselves and Haman, the Agagite. In a similar incident in 1943, the Nazis shot 10 Jews from the Piotrkow ghetto. On Purim Eve that same year, over 100 Jewish doctors and their families were shot by the Nazis in Czestochowa. The following day, Jewish doctors were taken from Radom and shot nearby in another town that I can't pronounce. At the end of the war, the Allies chose to have trials, and the trials were held in Nuremberg, same place where these infamous laws had been passed. And there were 22 German Nazi leaders who were indicted because of their atrocities against the Jews and others. Twelve of those were sentenced to death by hanging on 1 October 1946 for their part in their crimes against humanity, including the Holocaust. One of those who was convicted was this guy, Martin Bornmann. He was actually sentenced in absentia, so he couldn't be hanged because he wasn't there. Göring over here, you remember the infamous head of the Luftwaffe? He evaded the noose because he managed to commit suicide in his cell. He took a cyanide capsule. You know how many Nazis that left to be hanged? 10. And they were hanged on the 16th of October 1946, the very same number as Haman's sons who were hanged almost 2.5 millennia earlier. Remember how they derided Purim, how they killed 10 Jews on Purim? 10 Nazi leaders are hanged. If you're worried that that's not accurate, well, I just put 2 newspaper clippings there from the time. Göring ends life by poison. 10 others hanged in Nuremberg. The New York Herald Tribune. Göring, a suicide 2 hours before 10 hang. Swallows hidden poison in Nuremberg cell. Streicher cries out Heil Hitler as he dies. Interestingly, in the Jewish Talmud, it says that in the Purim story that Haman's daughter committed suicide and thus wasn't hanged, similar to Göring. And Moshe Katz says the following about the outcome of the Nuremberg trials. Since the trial was conducted by a military tribunal, the sentence handed down should have been death by firing squad or by electric chair as practiced in the USA. However, the court specifically prescribed hanging, exactly as in Esther's original request. Let Haman's 10 sons be hanged. Once again, a connection between Hitler and the Nazis and the role of Haman. Hitler said in a speech, the 30th of January 1944, that if the Nazis were defeated, the Jews would celebrate a second Purim. And Julius Streicher, the guy I mentioned over to you, seems to have been aware of the parallel because he was heard to sarcastically remark before they hanged him, Purim Fest, 1946, as he ascended the scaffold. So he compared what was happening to them to Purim. They knew the history. They weren't ignorant of it. Again, I get back to the question, why list the names of Haman's sons? For those of you who've studied Hebrew this year, this might make more sense to you, but in some manuscripts, it's interesting that in that list of names, 3 of the Hebrew letters, which I've highlighted there, are written smaller, significantly smaller than the others, in that list of 10 names. And so some believe that that contains a code. The very same part which lists the names of Haman's 10 sons has got 3 Hebrew letters, a Tav, a Shin, and a Zayim. As you can see there, the ones in red. And again, those who've studied Hebrew will know that the letters in Hebrew all have numbers assigned to them. They didn't have a separate numbering system. And so if you add the numbers together, you get 707. And that is the common form of the Jewish year 5707. You might not know the Jews have a different way of numbering the years than we do. And we number from the birth of Jesus. They number from what they believe was creation. So 5707. You know what there happens to be? It happens to be the year that the 10 Nazis were hanged. Nuremberg. This seeming code in the passage about the hanging of 10 of Haman's sons, Haman who tried to destroy the Jews, just happens to be the Jewish way of rendering the year 1946. And so the 10 Nazi defendants were hanged on the 16th of October 1946, which corresponds to the Jewish year 5707. The date of the execution, the 21st of Tishri, also happened to be the 7th day of Sukkot in the Hebrew calendar. And this is from Wikipedia. The 7th day of Sukkot is also known to the Jews as Hoshana Rabbah, the day that they believe that God's judgments are sealed for the following year. So on this day that the Jews believe is significant in terms of God's judgments, and in a year that just happens to correspond to that numeric pattern that we find in the book of Esther about the hanging of 10 of Haman's sons, 10 of these Nazis are hung. And so like Haman before them, the Nazis discovered to their own peril that the true God in heaven will avenge those who curse his covenant people. Here we see what I believe a numeric code written into the Bible prophesying what would happen in the future when these spiritual followers of Haman the Agagite would again try kill the Jews. And so it's apparent that God's providence played a role in the remarkable events leading up to Israel becoming a nation again after over 2,000 years. And those words spoken to Abram and his natural seed many years ago still ring true. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. So just to wrap it up, Scripture predicts, as I showed you, that ultimately, under Antichrist, all the nations of the world will turn on Israel. They'll have no friends left. It also says that at the second coming of Christ, God will rise up to defend his people when the world turns against them. Zechariah 14. And we are told in Joel 3 that Christ will judge the nations who hate Israel. So to wrap it up, should Christians support Israel or not? This is what God says to the nations who oppose Israel in the end times. Zechariah 2, verse 8 to 9. For thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you. For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they shall become plunder for those who serve them.